Good evening all, and welcome back to Grimroot. Tonight, we're setting sail into the dark waters of the open ocean with 7 disturbing, true cruise ship horror stories. These accounts come from passengers, crew members, and maritime workers who experienced something aboard those floating cities that they'll never forget. Each story is an absolute nightmare, pulled straight from the isolated corridors and endless decks where thousands of souls are trapped together, miles from any help. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Grimroot for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let's board these vessels of terror, where the ocean's vastness meets human evil, and there's nowhere to run. My name is Sarah, and I'm a travel blogger who's been on dozens of cruises over the past 5 years. I thought I'd seen everything the cruise industry had to offer, from luxury suites to budget interior cabins, from Caribbean party ships to elegant European river cruises. But what happened to me last October on the Oceanic Splendor, during a 7-day Mediterranean cruise, changed everything I thought I knew about life at sea. I booked this particular cruise because I was working on an article about solo female travel, and the Oceanic Splendor was marketed as one of the safest ships for women traveling alone. The vessel could hold over 4,000 passengers, and with that many people around, I figured I'd never truly be alone. I specifically requested a midship cabin on Deck 8, close enough to the main areas to feel secure, but not so close to the pool deck that I'd be kept awake by late-night parties. When I arrived at the Miami port for embarkation, everything seemed normal, the usual chaos of thousands of people trying to board at once, the excitement in the air, families taking photos by the massive ship. I'd done this routine so many times, I could practically sleepwalk through its security screening, check in, getting my cabin key card. It was all wonderfully familiar. The ship was beautiful, one of those newer vessels with glass elevators and LED lit atriums that made you feel like you were staying in a floating resort rather than just a boat. My assigned cabin was A2247, and when I found it, I was pleasantly surprised. It was slightly larger than I'd expected for an interior room, with a small sitting area and what appeared to be a recently renovated bathroom. The cabin steward, Miguel, introduced himself and explained that I was actually in a complimentary upgrade due to some last-minute changes in bookings. I didn't question it. Free upgrades happen occasionally in the cruise world, and I was grateful for the extra space. The first 3 days of the cruise were absolutely perfect. We visited Barcelona and Nice, I attended some excellent cooking classes, and I'd even made friends with a lovely couple from Ohio who were celebrating their 30th anniversary. Every evening, I'd return to my cabin around 10 p.m., shower, work on my blog posts, and fall asleep to the gentle rocking of the ship. The Oceanic Splendor was living up to its reputation as a well-run vessel. It was on the 4th night, as we sailed toward our next port in Rome, that things began to feel wrong. I'd returned to my cabin earlier than usual, around 8:30 p.m., because I had a mild headache and wanted to rest before dinner. As I slid my key card into the lock, I heard voices coming from inside my cabin, not the TV. I always turned that off when I left, but actual human voices speaking in hushed tones. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I'd somehow gotten confused about which cabin was mine. But no, there was my luggage tag on the door handle, and this was definitely 8247. I pressed my ear against the door and could make out at least 2 different voices, both male, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language I couldn't identify. My heart started racing. Had someone broken into my room? Were they stealing my belongings? I decided to call security from the house phone down the hall, rather than confront whoever was in my cabin. But as I turned to walk away, the voices suddenly stopped, and I heard footsteps approaching the door from the inside. I panicked and quickly walked to the elevator bank, pretending to wait for a car while keeping an eye on my cabin door. After about 5 minutes, the door opened, and 2 men in crew uniforms stepped out. They were carrying what looked like maintenance equipment, and they walked briskly toward the crew, only areas of the ship. Confused but somewhat relieved, I returned to my cabin. Everything appeared to be exactly as I'd left it. My laptop was still on the desk, my jewelry was still in the bathroom counter organizer, and my clothes were still hanging in the closet. Nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. I called the guest services desk to report what had happened, and they assured me that there had been some routine maintenance scheduled for various cabins that week, though they seemed surprised that no one had notified me in advance. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to Miguel when he came to clean my room. His reaction was strange. He seemed genuinely confused and insisted that no maintenance had been scheduled for my cabin. He even showed me his electronic tablet that listed all the service requests for cabins in his section, and cabin 8247 wasn't on it. When I described the two men I'd seen, Miguel's expression grew concerned, and he said he'd never seen anyone matching those descriptions working in the housekeeping or maintenance departments. That evening, I decided to stay in the main areas of the ship later than usual, not wanting to return to my cabin until I was absolutely exhausted. I spent time in the casino, caught a late show, and even grabbed a midnight snack in the buffet. It wasn't until nearly 1 a.m. that I finally made my way back to Deck 8. The corridors were dimly lit with emergency lighting, and most passengers were either asleep or still partying in the upper deck lounges. As I approached my cabin, I immediately noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to 8247 was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, but definitely not fully closed. I was absolutely certain I had locked it when I left that morning. I always double-check because I carried expensive camera equipment. I stood in the hallway for several minutes, listening for any sounds from inside, but heard nothing. Using my phone's flashlight, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, but something felt fundamentally different about the space. It took me a moment to realize what it was: the smell. There was a musty, stale odor that hadn't been there before, like the smell of old clothes or a room that had been closed up for months. But that wasn't possible on a cruise ship where the air conditioning ran constantly. I turned on the lights and immediately saw that someone had definitely been in my room. My suitcase, which I always kept zipped and positioned parallel to the wall, was now at a slight angle. The bathroom door, which I habitually left open, was now closed. Most disturbing of all, the sitting area chairs had been rearranged. They were now facing each other rather than facing the TV, as if someone had been having a conversation in my cabin. This time, I didn't call guest services. I was too frightened to stay in the room alone, so I grabbed my essential items and went directly to the 24-hour guest services desk on Deck 4. The night manager, a woman named Patricia, listened to my story with growing concern. She immediately dispatched 2 security officers to check my cabin thoroughly, and they found no signs of forced entry or any people hiding in the room. However, they did confirm that the furniture had been moved, and that there was an unusual smell they couldn't identify. Patricia offered to move me to a different cabin immediately, but here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. When she pulled up my reservation in the computer system, she frowned and asked me to repeat my cabin number. When I said 8247, she shook her head and told me that according to their records, cabin 8247 had been taken out of service 3 months ago due to what she called ongoing issues, and wasn't supposed to have any guests assigned to it. She showed me the computer screen, and there it was, cabin 8247, marked as UNVOBLMNIROKI in red letters. But somehow I'd been staying there for 4 days. Even more confusing, when she looked up my reservation, it showed that I was supposed to be in cabin 8251, 4 doors down from where I'd been sleeping. We walked back to Deck 8 together, and that's when I noticed something that still gives me chills. The nameplate beside the door of cabin 8247 wasn't the standard cruise ship door marker. Instead of the usual white plastic with black numbering, this door had an old, tarnished brass plate that looked like it belonged on a much older ship. The numbers were etched rather than printed, and the metal had a greenish patina that spoke of decades of salt air exposure. Patricia was as puzzled as I was. She radioed for the maintenance chief, who arrived within 10 minutes. When he saw the door, his face went pale. He told us that cabin 8247 had been sealed off after a passenger had died there under unusual circumstances during the ship's previous sailing. The room was supposed to be completely inaccessible, with the electronic locks disabled and the door marked as out of service. Yet somehow, my key card had been programmed to open that room, and I'd been staying in what was essentially a cabin that officially didn't exist for guests. The maintenance chief couldn't explain how I'd been able to access the room, or who had been programming my keycard each day when I went to guest services for assistance. With various small issues throughout the cruise, they moved me to my originally assigned cabin, 8251, immediately. But as we transferred my belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I glanced back at cabin 8247, I expected to see those two men in crew uniforms standing there, but the hallway remained empty. The rest of the cruise passed without incident, but I never felt completely safe. Every night, I would lie in my new cabin and listen for sounds from 8247, just 4 doors away. Sometimes late at night, I swear I could hear muffled voices coming from that direction, even though Patricia had assured me the room was now properly sealed. When I disembarked in Miami, I tried to get more information about what had happened in cabin 8247, but the cruise line refused to provide any details beyond confirming that there had been a passenger incident that required the room to be taken out of service. I've since learned from cruise ship employee forums that cabin 8247 has a reputation among the crew as a room where guests frequently report strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and the feeling of being watched. I still travel and still take cruises, but I always double-check my cabin assignment now, and I always verify that my room is supposed to be available for guests. Because somewhere out there on the oceanic splendor, cabin 8247 is still marked as unavailable. But I have a terrible feeling that guests are still somehow ending up there, just like I did. And I can't stop wondering who were those men I saw leaving my cabin, and what were they doing in a room that was supposed to be empty. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a 34-year-old accountant from Denver. I'd never taken a cruise before, but after a particularly brutal divorce and an even more brutal year of legal battles, my sister convinced me that I needed to get away from everything. She booked us on a 10-day Southern Caribbean cruise aboard the Royal Odyssey, one of those massive ships that holds over 5,000 passengers. The idea was that with so many people around, I could disappear into the crowd and finally have some peace. The Royal Odyssey was unlike anything I'd ever seen. 15 decks of restaurants, pools, theaters, and shops. It was like a floating city, and I was amazed by how easy it was to get lost in the maze of corridors and elevators. My sister, Jennifer, and I had adjoining balcony cabins on deck 12, and from our rooms, we could see nothing but endless ocean stretching to the horizon. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The first few days were exactly what I needed. Jennifer and I spent our time by the pool, tried different restaurants, and attended some of the evening shows. I was starting to remember what it felt like to relax, to not constantly look over my shoulder or check my phone for angry messages from my ex-husband's lawyer. The ship felt like a sanctuary, a place where the outside world couldn't reach me. It was on the 3rd day, as we sailed toward Barbados, that I first noticed him. We were at the breakfast buffet, and I was waiting in line for the omelet station when I felt someone staring at me. I turned around and saw a man, probably in his mid-50s, standing about 10 feet away with a plate of food in his hands. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about the intensity of his gaze that made me uncomfortable. When our eyes met, he smiled, not a friendly smile, but something that felt predatory. I quickly turned back around and focused on ordering my breakfast. Later that morning, as Jennifer and I were finding seats by the main pool, I saw him again. He was sitting alone at a table near the pool bar, and he was definitely watching me. This time, when I noticed him, he raised his drink in what seemed like a toast in my direction. Jennifer noticed my discomfort and asked what was wrong, but I didn't want to ruin her vacation with my paranoia. I was probably just being oversensitive after everything I'd been through with my divorce. But throughout that day, everywhere we went, he seemed to be there, too. At the afternoon trivia contest, he was sitting 3 tables away, not participating but clearly watching me. During the evening show, I spotted him in the balcony section, and even though the theater held over 1,000 people, I could feel his eyes on me throughout the entire performance. When Jennifer and I went to the late-night comedy show, there he was again, sitting alone at the bar. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. On a ship with thousands of passengers, it made sense that you'd see the same people repeatedly, especially if you followed similar routines. But there was something about the deliberate way he positioned himself, always with a clear view of wherever I was sitting, that made my skin crawl. On the fourth day, as we docked in St. Lucia, I decided to book a solo excursion while Jennifer went on a different tour with some friends she'd made. I thought getting off the ship and spending the day exploring the island would give me a break from the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. The excursion was a rainforest hike to a waterfall, and there were about 20 people in our group. Halfway through the hike, during a water break, I was horrified to see him emerging from behind a group of trees. He wasn't part of our tour group. I was certain of that, because I'd carefully looked at everyone when we gathered at the meeting point. But there he was, acting like he belonged, making casual conversation with other hikers about the beautiful scenery. When he saw me staring, he waved enthusiastically, as if we were old friends. I approached our tour guide and quietly asked if we'd picked up additional people along the way. She looked confused and said no, that our group had been the same 20 people since we left the ship. When I pointed out the man, she frowned and said she'd never seen him before, and that he definitely wasn't part of any scheduled tour that day. She seemed as puzzled as I was about how someone could just appear in the middle of a guided rainforest hike. For the rest of the excursion, I stayed as close to the tour guide as possible, but I could see him at the edge of my vision, always maintaining the same distance, always watching. When we returned to the ship, I saw him getting back on board through the main gangway, as if he'd had every right to be on that island excursion. That evening, I decided to confront the situation directly. I went to guest services and explained that I felt like I was being followed by another passenger. The guest services manager, a professional woman named Carol, listened patiently and took down all the details. She asked if I knew the man's name or cabin number, but I realized I had no information about him except his general appearance. Carol assured me they would look into it and asked me to report any further incidents immediately. As I was leaving the guest services desk, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and there he was, standing so close I could smell his cologne, a heavy, cloying scent that made my stomach turn. He was smiling that same unsettling smile, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and friendly, which somehow made everything worse. "Rebecca," he said, and hearing my name from his lips made my blood run cold. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset when you were talking to the nice lady at the desk. I hope everything is all right." I hadn't told anyone my name during the excursion, and I certainly hadn't introduced myself to him. I'd been wearing my cruise ship ID card, but it was tucked inside my bag most of the time. I asked him how he knew my name, and his smile widened. "Oh, I make it my business to know the names of interesting people," he said. "You're in Cabin Huale, aren't you? I'm just down the hall in 20B. Funny how we keep running into each other." The casualness with which he mentioned my cabin number terrified me. How did he know where I was staying? Had he been watching me go in and out of my room? I didn't respond and quickly walked away, heading straight for the nearest elevator. But as the doors closed, I saw him standing there in the guest services area, still smiling, still watching. That night, I called Jennifer into my room and told her everything. She was as disturbed as I was and insisted we go back to guest services together to file a more detailed complaint. The next morning, Carol from guest services called my cabin and asked to meet with me privately. When I arrived at her office, she had a serious expression that immediately put me on edge. She explained that they had reviewed the passenger manifest and security footage, and there was something very strange about the situation. According to their records, Cabin 12B, the cabin the man had claimed to be staying in, was listed as occupied by a couple named James and Helen Morrison from Ontario, Canada. There was no single male passenger registered to that cabin. Even more disturbing, when security went to check Cabin 12B, they found the Morrisons exactly where they were supposed to be. A retired couple in their 70s who had been on the ship since embarkation, and had never heard of anyone matching the description I'd given. They had no idea who might have claimed to be staying in their cabin. Carol showed me the security footage from various parts of the ship, and while they could see me clearly in several locations I'd mentioned, the man I described was nowhere to be found in any of the recordings. It was as if he was invisible to the cameras while being perfectly visible to me. The footage from the guest services area showed me talking animatedly to empty air, which was impossible because I distinctly remembered him standing right next to me, speaking my name. That afternoon, as we sailed toward our next port, I was sitting on my balcony, trying to process what Carol had told me. The idea that I might be hallucinating or having some kind of breakdown terrified me, almost as much as the thought of being stalked. But then I heard a voice from the balcony next door, cabin 12B. "Beautiful view, isn't it, Rebecca?" It was his voice, unmistakably coming from the balcony that was supposed to belong to the elderly Canadian couple. I crept to the edge of my balcony and peered around the divider, but I couldn't see anyone. The voice continued, closer now, as if he was standing right at the divider between our balconies. "I've been enjoying our time together so much. It's nice to finally have someone who appreciates the same things I do." I could hear what sounded like a chair being moved, as if someone was settling in for a long conversation. "Why have 6 more days together, Rebecca? I'm looking forward to getting to know you better." I ran back into my cabin and immediately called Jennifer, who came over within minutes. But when we went back out to the balcony, everything was silent. The balcony next door appeared empty, and when we called out, there was no response. Jennifer suggested we go check on the Morrisons, so we walked down the hall and knocked on cabin 12B. Helen Morrison answered the door, and she was exactly as Carol had described it, a sweet, elderly woman who was clearly confused by our visit. When we asked if anyone else had access to their balcony, she assured us that she and her husband had been in their cabin all afternoon and hadn't heard any voices or seen anyone. Her husband, James, appeared behind her, and they both seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. For the remaining 6 days of the cruise, I never saw the man again. There were no more sightings in restaurants or theaters, no more appearances during excursions, no more voices from the balcony next door. It was as if he had simply vanished, which should have been a relief. But somehow, his absence felt almost more ominous than his presence had been. On the final night of the cruise, as I was packing my belongings, I found something that still haunts me. Tucked under my pillow was a ship's daily newsletter, but it wasn't from our cruise. The date on the newsletter was from 3 months earlier, and it was from a different ship entirely, the Ocean Princess. Someone had circled an article about a passenger who had gone missing during that cruise, a man in his mid-50s who had simply vanished from his cabin one night. The missing passenger's name was David Chen, and his cabin number was listed as 12B. The photo accompanying the article showed a man I recognized immediately. It was him, the man who had been following me, the man who claimed to be staying in cabin 12B on our ship. But according to the article, David Chen had disappeared at sea 3 months ago and was presumed dead. I never reported finding the newsletter because I knew how insane it would sound. Instead, I kept it, and I've spent countless hours since then researching David Chen and the Ocean Princess incident. What I discovered has kept me awake at night for months. David Chen hadn't just disappeared. He had been following and harassing a female passenger before his disappearance, a woman who had complained to security about being stalked by a man in cabin 12B. I don't take cruises anymore, and I probably never will again. Because somewhere out there on ships sailing across the world's oceans, I believe David Chen is still in cabin 12B, still following women who just want to disappear into the crowd and find some peace. And the most terrifying part is that no security camera will ever catch him, no passenger manifest will ever list his name, and no one will ever believe the women who try to report him. Sometimes, late at night, I still smell that heavy cologne, and I wonder if the ocean ever really gives up its dead, or if some of them just find new ways to hunt. My name is Marcus, and I'm a 28-year-old marine engineer who's worked on various vessels for the past 6 years. I thought I'd seen everything the maritime industry had to offer, from oil tankers to cargo ships to luxury yachts. When I got offered a temporary position on the Caribbean Majesty as a backup engineer for their 14-day transatlantic crossing, I jumped at the chance. The pay was excellent, and I figured working on a cruise ship would be a nice change of pace from the industrial vessels I was used to. The Caribbean Majesty was an older ship, built in the late 1990s, but she'd been recently renovated and could accommodate about 200 passengers. I was hired to fill in for their regular third engineer, who had fallen ill just days before departure. The chief engineer, a gruff Norwegian man named Eriksson, gave me a brief orientation and assigned me to the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., monitoring the engine room and various mechanical systems throughout the ship. For the first week, everything seemed routine. The Caribbean Majesty was well maintained, and the engineering crew was professional and experienced. My duties involved checking gauges, monitoring computer systems, and doing periodic walkthroughs of the lower decks to ensure everything was operating smoothly. The night shift was quiet, with most passengers asleep and only essential crew members working. It was during my second week, on night 9 of the crossing, that I discovered something that changed everything. I was doing my regular 3 a.m. walk through of Deck 2, which housed most of the ship's mechanical systems and crew quarters. This area was off limits to passengers and required special keycard access to enter. As I was checking the water purification systems, I heard voices coming from a section of the ship I'd never been to before. The voices were speaking in hushed tones, and I could make out at least 3 different people having what sounded like an urgent conversation. What struck me as odd was that this particular area, a corridor that led to what I thought were unused storage compartments, wasn't supposed to have any crew working there during the night shift. According to the ship's layout, those compartments had been sealed off during the renovation and weren't part of the active ship operations. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly made my way toward the voices. The corridor was dimly lit with emergency lighting, and I could see that someone had removed the restricted access signs that should have been posted. As I got closer, I realized the voices were speaking in a mixture of English, Spanish, and something that sounded Eastern European. I pressed myself against the wall and peered around the corner. What I saw made my blood freeze. There were 4 crew members I recognized, 2 from housekeeping, 1 from food service, and 1 who I thought worked in guest services, standing outside what appeared to be a modified storage room. The door was reinforced with additional locks, and there was electrical equipment rigged up that definitely wasn't part of the ship's original design. But what terrified me most was what I could hear, coming from inside that room. It was the sound of people, multiple people, crying and speaking in what sounded like pleading voices. The voices were muffled, as if coming from behind a heavy door or barrier, but they were unmistakably human sounds of distress. One of the crew members, a man I'd seen working in the Buffett restaurant, was holding a clipboard and checking off items on what looked like a list. Another crew member, a woman from housekeeping, was carrying a tray of food and water. As I watched in horror, she opened the reinforced door, and for just a moment, I could see inside. The room had been converted into what could only be described as a holding area. There were at least a dozen people inside, men and women who looked to be in their 20s and 30s, sitting on makeshift bedding on the floor. They were clearly not passengers or crew members. Their clothes were dirty, they looked malnourished, and several appeared to be restrained with plastic zip ties. I realized I was witnessing something far worse than any ghost story or supernatural encounter. This was human trafficking, happening right here on the ship I was working on. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my flashlight steady. I knew I had to get proof and report this immediately, but I also knew I was in extreme danger if these people discovered I'd seen what was happening. I carefully backed away from the corridor and returned to the engine room, my mind racing. I tried to think rationally about what I should do. We were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, still 5 days from port. The ship's communication systems were controlled by the senior officers, and I had no way of knowing how many crew members were involved in this operation. For all I knew, the captain and senior staff could be part of it. I decided to use my personal satellite phone, a device I'd brought for emergencies, to try to contact authorities. But when I pulled it out, I discovered that someone had tampered with it. The antenna had been carefully cut, and the device was completely non-functional. Someone knew I had the phone and had deliberately sabotaged it. Over the next 2 days, I tried to act normal while gathering more information. I started paying closer attention to crew movements and passenger manifests. What I discovered was that over the course of the voyage, Several passengers had been reported as disembarking early at various ports, but I'd never actually seen these people leave the ship. According to the official records, they'd left voluntarily, but now I suspected they'd never left at all. I also noticed that certain crew members had access to areas of the ship that should have been restricted, and there were supply deliveries happening during night hours that weren't on any official manifest. Food and water were being ordered in quantities that exceeded what would be needed for the registered passengers and crew. On the 12th night, I made a decision that probably saved my life but also put me in even more danger. I decided to try to document what was happening with my phone's camera. I waited until 4 a.m., when the corridor was usually empty, and made my way back to that restricted area. But this time, they were waiting for me. As soon as I turned the corner, powerful flashlights blinded me, and I found myself surrounded by 6 crew members, including Erickson, the chief engineer. The man I'd trusted to supervise me was apparently running this entire operation. "We've been wondering when you'd show up again, Marcus," Erickson said in his thick accent. "You've been asking too many questions, showing up in places you don't belong. That's not very smart for someone in your position." They searched me and confiscated my phone, but they didn't find the small digital camera I'd hidden in my tool belt. One of the crew members, the woman from housekeeping, suggested they add me to the cargo, but Erickson shook his head. He explained that my disappearance would be too suspicious, since the marine engineering company would be expecting detailed reports about my temporary assignment. Instead, they offered me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. I could either join their operation and receive a substantial cut of the profits, or I could have an accident during one of my night shifts. Industrial accidents on ships were common, Erickson explained, and my body would never be found if I went overboard in the middle of the Atlantic. I agreed to cooperate, knowing it was my only chance to survive and potentially stop what was happening. For the remaining 2 days of the voyage, I pretended to be part of their crew while secretly documenting everything I could with the hidden camera. I learned that this operation had been running for over 2 years, and that the Caribbean Majesty was just one of several ships being used to transport people who had been kidnapped or sold into slavery. When we finally reached port in Southampton, I was escorted off the ship by 2 crew members who made it clear that they would be watching me. They had my home address, my family's contact information, and photos of me entering and leaving my apartment building. If I contacted authorities, they said, I would disappear permanently and my family would be at risk as well. For 3 months after returning home, I lived in constant fear. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and jumped at every unexpected sound. But I also couldn't live with the knowledge of what I'd witnessed without doing something about it. I eventually contacted an FBI task force that specializes in international trafficking and provided them with all the evidence I'd gathered. The investigation took nearly a year, but they eventually arrested 17 crew members and shut down the trafficking operation. The Caribbean Majesty was impounded, and the cruise line faced federal charges. More importantly, they rescued 43 people who had been held captive on various ships in the trafficking network. I still work as a marine engineer, but I'll never set foot on another cruise ship. The industry's investigation revealed that trafficking operations had been using cruise ships for years, taking advantage of the fact that these vessels travel international waters and are subject to complex jurisdictional issues that make law enforcement difficult. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about those voices I heard coming from that modified storage room, and I wonder how many other ships are out there right now, carrying human cargo that will never appear on any passenger manifest. The ocean is vast, and once you're out there, you're completely at the mercy of whoever controls the ship you're on. I testified in federal court against the crew members, but I still look over my shoulder every day, because human trafficking is a billion-dollar industry, and the people who run it don't forgive those who interfere with their operations. Every cruise ship that passes by my apartment window reminds me that somewhere out there, people are still trapped below deck, waiting for someone to hear their voices and come to their rescue. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm a 42 year-old emergency physician who spent 8 months working as the head medical officer aboard the Paradise Dream, a luxury cruise ship that operated primarily in the Mediterranean. I took the position because I was burned out from working in busy hospital emergency rooms and thought that cruise ship medicine would be a relaxing change of pace, dealing with minor injuries, seasickness, and the occasional heart attack. I had no idea that I was about to encounter the most disturbing medical mystery of my career. The Paradise Dream was a beautiful vessel, one of those newer ships designed to look more like a floating resort than a traditional cruise liner. It carried about 400 or 500 passengers and had a state-of-the-art medical facility that included a small emergency room, a surgical suite, and even a morgue, which I hoped I'd never have to use. The medical staff consisted of myself, 2 nurses, and a part-time physician's assistant who helped during busy periods. For the first month, everything was exactly what I'd expected. I treated sunburns, minor cuts from broken glass, a few cases of food poisoning, and helped several elderly passengers manage their chronic conditions. The work was routine, the hours were reasonable, and I finally felt like I was practicing medicine without the constant pressure and chaos of a major metropolitan hospital. It was during my second month aboard the ship that I began to notice a pattern that deeply disturbed me. We were on a 12-day cruise from Barcelona to various Greek islands, and I started seeing passengers who presented with similar symptoms: severe headaches, dizziness, confusion, and what appeared to be early signs of neurological impairment. Initially, I attributed these cases to a combination of factors common on cruise ships: dehydration, alcohol consumption, medication interactions, and the stress of travel. But as the days passed, the symptoms in these patients became more severe and more specific. They developed what I can only describe as rapid onset dementia-like symptoms. Passengers who had been perfectly lucid and coherent when they first came to see me were returning within 24 to 48 hours in states of severe confusion, unable to recognize family members or remember basic information about themselves. The first case that really alarmed me was Margaret Sullivan, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Boston, who came to the medical center on day 4 of the cruise complaining of a severe headache. She was traveling with her husband, Robert, and both seemed like typical cruise passengers, friendly, excited about their vacation, and in reasonably good health for their age. Margaret's vital signs were normal, and her initial neurological exam showed no abnormalities. I treated her headache with standard pain medication and advised her to stay hydrated and avoid excessive alcohol consumption. But less than 48 hours later, Robert brought Margaret back to the medical center in a state I'd never seen before. She couldn't remember her own name, didn't recognize her husband, and seemed to have lost decades of memories. When I asked her what year it was, she said, 1987. When I asked her where she was, she looked around the medical center with genuine terror and asked if she was in a hospital because she was dying. I immediately ordered comprehensive blood work and arranged for her to be monitored in our small inpatient unit. But here's where things became truly disturbing. When I went to review Margaret's test results the next morning, I discovered that all of her medical records from our computer system had been deleted. Not just the recent tests, but her entire patient file, including her initial visit for the headache. It was as if Margaret Sullivan had never been a patient at all. When I asked our head nurse, Patricia, about the missing records, she looked at me with genuine confusion and said she had no memory of treating anyone named Margaret Sullivan. Even more bizarre, when I went to check on Margaret in our inpatient unit, the bed was empty, and according to the ship's passenger manifest, there was no one by that name registered on the cruise. I immediately went to find Robert Sullivan, Margaret's husband, but when I located him at the breakfast buffet, he was sitting alone and appeared to be perfectly content. When I approached him and asked about his wife, he looked at me blankly and said he was traveling solo, that he'd never been married. He seemed genuinely confused about why I was asking about a wife he claimed not to have. This experience shook me to my core, but I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I had confused passengers' names, or maybe I was experiencing some kind of stress-related memory issues myself. But over the following weeks, the same pattern repeated with other passengers. I would treat someone for neurological symptoms. They would return in a state of severe cognitive decline, and then they would simply disappear from all records, as if they had never existed. The turning point came during my 4th month on the ship, when I decided to secretly document everything. I started taking photos of patients with my personal phone, keeping handwritten notes in a journal I hid in my cabin, and even recording some patient interactions. I was determined to have proof that these people existed, and that something terrible was happening to them. It was during this investigation that I discovered something that still haunts me. Late one night, I was doing rounds in the medical center when I heard voices coming from the morgue, a facility that should have been empty since we hadn't had any deaths on the current cruise. I quietly approached the morgue door and listened. I could hear at least 3 people talking, and they were discussing processing times and shipment schedules. Using my master key, I carefully opened the morgue door and peered inside. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the ship's operations. The morgue had been converted into what appeared to be a medical laboratory, complete with equipment I didn't recognize and several examining tables with people on them. People who appeared to be alive but heavily sedated. Standing around these tables were 3 individuals I recognized: Dr. Richards, the ship's consulting neurologist, who I'd been told only worked part-time, Patricia, the head nurse, and Captain Morrison himself. They were dressed in surgical scrubs and appeared to be conducting some kind of medical procedures on the sedated patients. As I watched in horror, Dr. Richards was extracting what appeared to be cerebrospinal fluid from one of the patients, while Captain Morrison took notes on a clipboard. Patricia was monitoring vital signs and adjusting IV drips that were connected to each patient. The patients appeared to be the same people I had been treating for neurological symptoms, including Margaret Sullivan, whom I now recognized despite her pale, unconscious state. I was so shocked by what I was seeing that I accidentally dropped my phone, and the sound echoed through the morgue. All 3 of them turned toward the door, and I found myself face to face with Captain Morrison, who looked more angry than surprised to see me. Vasquez, he said calmly, "I think we need to have a conversation." They brought me into the makeshift laboratory and explained what I had stumbled upon. The Paradise Dream was being used as a floating research facility for an illegal medical research program focused on neurological diseases and memory manipulation. The passengers who developed the mysterious symptoms weren't getting sick naturally. They were being deliberately infected with experimental compounds that were designed to cause rapid cognitive decline. Dr. Richards, who wasn't actually a consulting neurologist, but rather a researcher who had been stripped of his medical license years earlier, explained that they were conducting human trials for potential treatments for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. The cruise ship setting was perfect because passengers were isolated from their regular doctors, surrounded by unfamiliar people who might not notice behavioral changes, and part of a controlled environment where medical emergencies could be managed privately. Captain Morrison revealed that this operation had been running for over 3 years and that they had processed hundreds of passengers during that time. The passengers who survived the experimental treatments had their memories altered or erased entirely, which explained why people like Robert Sullivan couldn't remember their spouses. Those who didn't survive were buried at sea during night hours, listed as deaths from natural causes. They offered me the same choice that I now realize they had probably offered to other medical staff who had discovered their operation join them and receive substantial financial compensation, or become one of their test subjects myself. The research was too important to be stopped by ethical concerns, they argued, and the potential benefits to humanity justified the sacrifices of a few cruise passengers who wouldn't be missed. I agreed to cooperate because I knew it was my only chance of survival and potentially stopping what was happening. For the next 2 months, I pretended to be part of their research team while secretly documenting everything and trying to find a way to contact authorities. I learned that the operation extended far beyond just the Paradise Dream. They had researchers on at least 6 different cruise ships, and they were funded by a pharmaceutical company that was desperate to fast-track research on neurological treatments. When we finally docked in Barcelona at the end of my contract, I had enough evidence to expose the entire operation. I contacted Interpol and provided them with photos, video recordings, patient documentation, and detailed information about the research protocols. The investigation took nearly 8 months, but they eventually arrested 23 people involved in the operation, including Captain Morrison, Dr. Richards, and several pharmaceutical company executives. The Paradise Dream was impounded, and investigators found evidence of medical experiments on over 400 passengers across multiple cruises. Many of the victims were elderly travelers who had been specifically targeted because their disappearances or behavioral changes were less likely to be investigated by authorities. I no longer work as a ship's doctor, and I've returned to hospital emergency medicine, despite the stress and chaos, because now I know that some medical research has no ethical boundaries, and that the isolation of cruise ships makes them perfect laboratories for people who want to experiment on human beings without oversight or accountability. Sometimes, former colleagues ask me why I left such a dream job, working on luxury cruise ships, and I tell them that some dreams are actually nightmares. The worst part is knowing that there are probably other ships out there right now, carrying passengers who think they're on vacation, but are actually unwitting test subjects in medical experiments that should never be conducted on human beings. Every time I see a cruise ship advertisement promising the vacation of a lifetime, I think about Margaret Sullivan and wonder if she's still alive somewhere, unable to remember her own name or the husband who forgot she ever existed. My name is Jonathan Hayes, and I'm a 45-year-old insurance investigator who specializes in maritime claims. I'd been working unusual cases for over 15 years, but I never expected to become part of one myself when I booked a cabin on the Ocean Vista for what was supposed to be a relaxing 10-day Caribbean cruise. I thought I was finally taking a real vacation. Instead, I stumbled into the most horrifying insurance fraud scheme I've ever encountered. The Ocean Vista was a mid-sized ship carrying about 800 passengers, and I'd chosen it specifically because it had a reputation for being well managed and safe. As someone who'd investigated dozens of maritime accidents and insurance claims, I knew which cruise lines to avoid and which ones had solid safety records. The Ocean Vista had never had a serious incident in its 12-year operational history. I was traveling alone, occupying a balcony cabin on Deck 9 that gave me a perfect view of the ocean. My daily routine was simple morning coffee on the balcony, breakfast in the main dining room, sometime by the pool or in the library, and evening entertainment. For the first 4 days, it was exactly the peaceful vacation I'd been hoping for. It was on the 5th night, as we sailed between Jamaica and Grand Cayman, that I witnessed what I initially thought was a tragic accident. I was on my balcony around 11:30 p.m., enjoying a nightcap and the surprisingly calm seas, when I heard voices from somewhere above me. The voices were speaking in urgent, hushed tones, and I could make out at least 3 different people, having what sounded like an argument. I stepped to the edge of my balcony and looked up, trying to see where the voices were coming from. Above me was Deck 10, which housed more balcony cabins, and above that was Deck 11, which contained some premium suites. The conversation seemed to be coming from the Deck 11 level, but I couldn't see anyone from my position. Suddenly, the arguing stopped, and I heard what sounded like a struggle, furniture being moved, someone saying, "No, please," and then a loud splash in the water below. I immediately rushed to the other side of my balcony and looked down at the ocean. In the ship's wake, I could see someone in the water, arms flailing, clearly trying to swim, but being left behind as the massive ship continued its course. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my cabin phone and called the bridge immediately, reporting a passenger overboard and providing the approximate location where I'd seen the person in the water. Within minutes, I could hear the ship's emergency alarm system activating, and I felt the vessel beginning to slow and turn. From my balcony, I watched as the crew launched rescue boats and began searching the area with powerful spotlights. But what I witnessed next made me realize this wasn't the accident I'd initially thought it was. As the crew conducted their search, I saw 3 people on the Deck 11 balcony directly above me. They were watching the rescue operation with what appeared to be casual interest, not the panic or concern you'd expect from witnesses to a tragedy. One of them, a man in his 50s wearing crew attire, was actually checking his watch as if he was timing something. The rescue operation continued for over 2 hours, but they never found anyone. Captain Rodriguez eventually made an announcement that despite an extensive search, no passenger could be located, and that a thorough investigation would be conducted to determine what had happened. The ship resumed its course toward Grand Cayman, and most passengers returned to their cabins, but I couldn't sleep. Something about what I'd witnessed felt wrong, and my years of investigating insurance fraud had taught me to trust those instincts. The next morning, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I started by reviewing the ship's daily newsletter from the previous day, looking for any mention of missing passengers or safety concerns. There was nothing. I then went to the guest services desk and casually asked if there had been any updates about the passenger who had gone overboard. The staff member, a young woman named Kelly, looked at me with genuine confusion and said she hadn't heard anything about anyone going overboard. When I insisted that I had personally reported it and that there had been a rescue operation, she checked her computer system and said there were no incident reports from the previous night. This was impossible. I had made the call myself. I had watched the rescue boats. I had heard the captain's announcement. But according to the ship's official records, none of it had happened. I asked to speak with someone in security, and after waiting for nearly an hour, I was told that the security chief was unavailable and that there were no incidents to discuss. Frustrated but determined, I decided to find the balcony where I'd seen the 3 people watching the rescue operation. I took the elevator to deck 11 and walked along the corridor, trying to determine which suite was directly above my cabin. When I found what I believed to be the right location, I knocked on the door. The door was answered by a woman in her 60s who appeared to be a regular passenger. She introduced herself as Dorothy Chen and seemed friendly enough, but when I asked if she had witnessed the incident the night before, she looked genuinely puzzled. She said she'd been asleep early and hadn't heard any commotion. When I described seeing 3 people on her balcony, she insisted that she was traveling alone and that no one else had access to her suite. I asked if I could step onto her balcony to verify the angle of view, and she agreed. Standing there, I could see directly down to my own balcony, confirming that this was definitely where I'd seen the 3 people. But Dorothy Chen seemed sincere in her confusion, and there was no evidence that anyone else had been in her suite. Over the next 2 days, I continued investigating while trying to appear like a normal passenger enjoying his vacation. I spent time in the ship's library, researching maritime law and passenger rights. I also started paying closer attention to other passengers, looking for anyone who might have gone missing. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. According to the ship's daily passenger count, which was posted in crew areas for safety purposes, the Ocean Vista had departed Miami with 847 passengers. But when I carefully counted the numbers being announced for various activities and meal seatings, it appeared we now had only 846 passengers. One person had indeed disappeared, but there was no official acknowledgement of this fact. I also started researching the Ocean Vista's history more thoroughly, using the ship's internet service to access maritime databases. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 3 years, the Ocean Vista had reported 6 passenger overboard incidents, but in each case, the passenger who had gone missing had taken out substantial life insurance policies within 6 months of their cruise. Even more suspicious, all 6 passengers had been traveling alone. All had booked their cruises through the same travel agency, and all had been staying in premium suites on higher decks. The insurance payouts for these 6 cases totaled over $12 million, and in each instance, the beneficiaries had been distant relatives or business associates rather than immediate family members. On my 8th day aboard the ship, I decided to take a significant risk. I booked an appointment with the ship's photographer, claiming I wanted professional photos taken in my suite for a family album, but instead of posing for pictures, I asked the photographer, a young man named Carlos, if he'd noticed anything unusual about passenger behavior during the cruise. Carlos was initially reluctant to talk, but when I mentioned that I was an insurance investigator, his demeanor changed. He told me that he'd been working on cruise ships for 5 years and had noticed patterns that disturbed him. Certain passengers, always wealthy individuals traveling alone, would be specifically targeted by crew members who would befriend them, learn about their personal situations, and encourage them to spend time in isolated areas of the ship. Carlos explained that there was a small group of crew members led by someone in the ship's security department who specialized in identifying passengers with substantial life insurance policies and no close family connections. These passengers would be systematically isolated, befriended, and eventually murdered in ways that appeared to be accidents. The man I'd seen in crew attire watching the rescue operation was Vincent Torres, the assistant security chief, who Carlos said was the ringleader of the operation. Torres had access to passenger information, insurance records, and the ability to manipulate incident reports and security footage. He'd been running this scheme for years, working with accomplices both on the ship and on shore. Carlos had been documenting evidence for months, but he was terrified to report it, because Torres had threatened him and his family. He showed me photos he'd secretly taken of Torres and his accomplices meeting with targeted passengers, as well as records of passengers who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. We decided to work together to gather enough evidence to expose the operation. Carlos provided me with names, dates, and photographic evidence, while I used my investigative skills to trace the insurance policies and financial connections. What we uncovered was a sophisticated murder-for-hire scheme that had been operating across multiple cruise ships for at least 5 years. The passengers weren't being killed randomly. They were being specifically selected, cultivated, and murdered by a network of corrupt crew members who were receiving substantial payments from offshore accounts connected to the insurance beneficiaries. The accidents were carefully planned to occur in international waters, where investigations would be minimal and jurisdiction would be unclear. When we docked in Fort Lauderdale, Carlos and I immediately contacted the FBI and provided them with all the evidence we'd gathered. The investigation that followed uncovered one of the largest maritime insurance fraud rings in history. Vincent Torres and 8 other crew members were arrested, along with several onshore accomplices who had been helping to identify targets and collect insurance payouts. The Ocean Vista was impounded for 6 months, while investigators examined evidence and interviewed hundreds of passengers and crew members from previous cruises. The investigation revealed that at least 23 passengers had been murdered over a 5-year period, with insurance payouts totaling over $45 million. I testified in federal court against Torres and his accomplices, and I've since worked with maritime law enforcement agencies to help identify similar schemes on other cruise lines. The case changed how the cruise industry handles passenger safety and incident reporting, and it led to new regulations requiring independent verification of all overboard incidents. I still take cruises occasionally, but now I know that the greatest danger on these ships isn't storms or mechanical failures. It's the people who see isolated passengers as opportunities for profit. Every time I stand on a ship's balcony and look out at the endless ocean, I think about those 23 people who were murdered and thrown overboard, and I wonder how many other passengers have disappeared into those dark waters without anyone ever knowing the truth about what happened to them. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time and you're willing to ask the dangerous questions, you can expose the monsters who think they can literally get away with murder on the high seas. My name is Amanda Chen, and I'm a 31-year-old travel photographer who has documented luxury resorts and cruise ships around the world for various magazines and travel websites. I've been on over 40 cruises in my career, and I thought I'd seen every corner of every type of ship imaginable when I was contracted by Coastal Living magazine to do a feature story on the Sovereign Seas, a brand new luxury vessel on its maiden voyage. I was excited about the opportunity to photograph a ship that no other journalist had documented yet. The Sovereign Seas was truly impressive, a floating palace with 18 decks that could accommodate 200 passengers. Everything was state-of-the-art, from the multiple pools and restaurants to the rock climbing walls and Broadway-style theater. As a photographer, I was given special access privileges that regular passengers didn't have, including permission to photograph in crew areas and behind the scenes operations for my article about life aboard a modern cruise ship. My contact was Alina Martinez, the ship's public relations director, who had arranged for me to have a premium suite and complete access to document everything, from the bridge operations to the massive kitchens that fed thousands of people daily. Elena was professional and accommodating, providing me with a special crew access card that would allow me to enter restricted areas for my photography work. For the first week of the 14-day repositioning cruise from Barcelona to Miami, everything went perfectly. I photographed the elegant dining rooms, the impressive engineering spaces, the crew quarters, and even got some great shots of the bridge during navigation operations. The crew was cooperative and professional, and I was getting exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes content that Coastal Living wanted for their feature story. It was during the second week, as we sailed across the Atlantic, that I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about cruise ship operations. I was doing a late evening photography session in the crew areas on Deck 2, trying to capture the 24-hour nature of ship operations, when I took a wrong turn in the maze of corridors and found myself in an area I'd never seen before. The corridor was different from the rest of the crew spaces, older looking, with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights that gave everything an eerie, industrial feel. There were no signs or markings to indicate what this area was used for, and my crew access card shouldn't have worked on the door, but it did. I figured this must be part of the older section of the ship that hadn't been renovated yet. As I walked down the corridor, taking photos of what I thought were just interesting architectural details, I heard voices coming from behind a heavy metal door, marked only with the number 7. The voices were speaking in hushed tones, and I could make out several different languages being spoken: English, Spanish, and what sounded like Tagalog or another Filipino dialect. I pressed my ear against the door and realized the voices belonged to crew members, but they were discussing something that made my blood run cold. They were talking about merchandise and delivery schedules and processing times. At first, I thought they might be discussing ship supplies or passenger services, but as I listened longer, it became clear they were talking about people. One voice, speaking in accented English, was saying something about the new arrivals from Thailand and how they needed to process them before we reach Miami. Another voice was discussing pricing for the American market and ensuring the merchandise stays healthy during transport. I realized I was listening to what sounded like human trafficking operations. My hands were trembling as I quietly took out my camera and began photographing the door and the surrounding area. I knew I needed evidence of what I was hearing, but I also knew I was in extreme danger if these people discovered me. I carefully backed away from the door and tried to find my way back to the main crew areas, but the corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, with dozens of similar doors and branching passages. As I was trying to navigate my way out, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see a crew member I recognized, James Rodriguez, one of the assistant cruise directors who had been helping coordinate my photography access. But seeing him in this forbidden area at this late hour immediately made me suspicious. "Amanda," he said, his usually friendly demeanor now cold and calculating. "You're pretty far from the main photography areas. Are you lost?" There was something threatening in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a casual encounter. He knew exactly why I was there, and he knew what I had overheard. I tried to act casual, explaining that I had taken a wrong turn while documenting the crew areas, but James wasn't buying it. He noticed my camera and asked to see what photos I had taken in this area. When I hesitated, he stepped closer and said that all photography in this section required special approval that I didn't have. He escorted me back to the main crew areas, but not before making it clear that I had wandered into a restricted zone that was off limits, even to someone with my special access privileges. He confiscated my camera's memory card, claiming it was a security protocol for photos taken in sensitive areas, and told me he would return it after the images had been reviewed by the ship's security team. Over the next 2 days, I tried to act normally while processing what I had witnessed. James had returned my memory card, but I suspected that all the photos from that corridor had been deleted. I decided to be more careful in my investigation, using a small backup camera I always carried and being more strategic about when and where I explored. I started paying closer attention to crew movements and passenger manifests. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. According to the official passenger count, the Sovereign Seas had departed Barcelona with 584 passengers, But when I carefully observed boarding and disembarkation procedures at our stops in the Canary Islands and Bermuda, the numbers didn't add up. People were getting on the ship who weren't appearing on any passenger lists, and they weren't using the main gangways that regular passengers used. I also noticed that certain crew members had access to areas of the ship that weren't on any official deck plans. There were elevators that required special key cards and went to decks that supposedly didn't exist. Food and medical supplies were being delivered to areas that weren't marked on any of the ship diagrams I'd been given for my article. My breakthrough came on the 12th day of the cruise, when I decided to follow one of the food service elevators that I'd noticed was being used at odd hours. I hid in a supply closet near the elevator bank and waited until I saw the crew members loading carts of food and water onto the elevator. When the doors closed, I watched the indicator lights and saw that the elevator was stopping at what appeared to be a deck between decks 1 and 2, a level that officially didn't exist. Using my backup camera, I documented everything I could about these mysterious elevator trips. I photographed crew members, recorded times and dates, and even managed to get some audio recordings of conversations. What I learned was that the Sovereign Seas had been specifically designed with hidden compartments and secret decks that were being used to transport people who had been trafficked from various countries. The merchandise I had heard them discussing were human beings, men and women who had been kidnapped, sold, or tricked into boarding the ship. They were being held in the hidden areas during the cruise and would be delivered to buyers when we reached Miami. The operation was being run by a group of corrupt crew members working with international trafficking networks. Elena Martinez, my supposed contact from the Public Relations Department, was actually one of the ringleaders. My special access privileges hadn't been arranged to help me document the ship for a magazine article. They had been designed to test whether I would stumble upon their operation and how I would react if I did. I had been under surveillance from the moment I boarded. On the 13th day, I was approached by Captain Holbrook himself, who invited me to have dinner with him in his private dining room. During the meal, he calmly explained that I had discovered something that couldn't be allowed to become public knowledge. The trafficking operation generated millions of dollars in revenue and involved people in high positions within the cruise industry and various governments. He offered me a choice. I could either accept a substantial payment to forget what I had seen and write a glowing article about the ship's luxury amenities, or I could disappear during the cruise and become another tragic case of a passenger who had an accident at sea. Captain Holbrook explained that my death would be particularly believable because I had been taking risks to get dramatic photographs, and accidents happened to adventurous photographers all the time. I agreed to cooperate because I knew it was my only chance of survival, but I had already taken precautions. Before the dinner with Captain Holbrook, I had uploaded all of my evidence to a secure cloud server and had set up an automated system to send everything to the FBI, Interpol, and several major news outlets if I didn't check in within 24 hours of the ship's arrival in Miami. When we docked in Miami, I was escorted off the ship by Elena Martinez and James Rodriguez, who made it clear that they would be monitoring me closely. But within hours of reaching shore, federal agents were boarding the Sovereign Seas with search warrants. The investigation that followed uncovered one of the largest maritime human trafficking operations in history. The Sovereign Seas was impounded, and investigators found evidence of secret compartments holding 127 people who had been trafficked from 12 different countries. Captain Holbrook, Elena Martinez, James Rodriguez, and 34 other crew members were arrested and eventually convicted of federal trafficking charges. The investigation also exposed corruption within the cruise line's corporate structure and led to criminal charges against several executives. My article for Coastal Living was never published, but my testimony helped convict the people responsible for this horrific operation. I still work as a travel photographer, but I'll never look at cruise ships the same way again. Every time I see one of those massive vessels, I wonder what secrets are hidden in the areas that passengers never see. The ocean is vast and largely unpatrolled, making it the perfect environment for criminal operations that most people can't even imagine. The Sovereign Seas may have been shut down, But I know there are other ships out there, carrying human cargo in hidden compartments, using their legitimate operations as cover for crimes that destroy countless lives. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about those 127 people we rescued, and I wonder how many others are still out there, trapped in the hidden spaces of ships that look like floating paradises, but are actually floating prisons. The cruise industry promotes the idea that their ships are safe havens where you can escape from the world's problems. But the truth is that some of the world's worst problems are hiding just below the surface of that gleaming luxury. My name is Chef Marcus Thompson, and I'm a 38-year-old culinary consultant who specializes in large-scale food service operations. I've worked in everything from hospital kitchens to military mess halls, but when I was offered a 6-month contract as an executive chef consultant aboard the majestic Voyager, I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to experience luxury cruise dining from the inside. The ship was known for having some of the finest restaurants at sea, and I was excited to help elevate their already impressive culinary program. The majestic Voyager was a massive vessel, carrying 800 passengers and featuring 12 different restaurants, from casual buffets to intimate specialty dining rooms. The main galley was a marvel of efficiency, a stainless steel cathedral that operated 24 hours a day, preparing over 30,000 meals per day. As the consulting executive chef, my job was to streamline operations, improve food quality, and help train the international kitchen staff. My supervisor was Executive Chef Laurent Dubois, a Frenchman who had been working on cruise ships for over 20 years. Laurent was respected throughout the industry and had a reputation for running tight, efficient operations. The kitchen staff consisted of over 200 people from various countries: the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, and South America, all working under strict hierarchies and demanding schedules. For the first month, everything seemed to operate exactly as I expected. The kitchens were immaculate, the food quality was excellent, and the staff was professional and hard-working. I spent my time observing operations, reviewing menus, and working with Laurent to implement efficiency improvements. The cruise line executives were pleased with the early results of our collaboration. It was during my second month aboard the ship that I began to notice irregularities that initially seemed minor but gradually became more disturbing. I discovered that certain high-end ingredients were being ordered in quantities that far exceeded what was needed for the restaurants I was familiar with. Wagyu beef, fresh truffles, exotic seafood, and premium wines were being delivered in massive quantities, but I couldn't account for where these items were being used. When I asked Laurent about the discrepancy, he explained that there was a special dining program for VIP passengers that operated separately from the main restaurant operations. He said it was highly confidential and involved only the most exclusive guests, who paid premium prices for ultra-luxury dining experiences. As a consultant, he explained, I didn't need to be involved in this particular aspect of the ship's operations. But my curiosity was piqued, especially when I started noticing that certain kitchen staff members, always the most experienced and trusted workers, would disappear for hours at a time during their shifts. When I asked other staff members where these workers went, they would give evasive answers or claim they didn't know. There was clearly a parallel kitchen operation happening that I wasn't being told about. My concern deepened when I started paying attention to passenger demographics and began noticing patterns that disturbed me. Certain passengers, always traveling alone, always wealthy, always elderly, would be given special attention by the dining staff. These passengers would be seated at specific tables in the main dining room, served by particular waiters, and given what appeared to be slightly different meals than other guests. I decided to investigate by following one of the senior kitchen staff members, Carlos, who regularly disappeared during the dinner service. I waited until he left the main galley, then followed him through a series of service corridors I'd never explored before. He used a special key card to access an elevator that I didn't even know existed, and I watched the floor indicators show that he was going to what appeared to be a deck between decks 3 and 4. Using my master access card, I managed to get the elevator to stop at the same level. When the doors opened, I found myself in what could only be described as a second, secret kitchen. It was smaller than the main galley but equipped with high-end equipment that was even more sophisticated than what we used for regular passenger dining. The space was immaculate, and I could see several kitchen staff members working on elaborate dishes that looked far more complex than anything served in the ship's restaurants. But what I saw next made my stomach turn. In one section of the kitchen, I watched as Carlos and two other chefs were preparing what appeared to be human organs for cooking. They were working with what looked like kidneys, livers, and other internal organs, treating them with the same professional care they would use for any other premium ingredient. The organs were fresh, expertly cleaned, and being prepared using classical French cooking techniques. I stood there in shock, unable to process what I was witnessing. These weren't animal organs. The size, shape, and color were unmistakably human. The chefs were discussing cooking times and preparation methods in the same casual way they would talk about preparing beef tenderloin or fresh fish. They were treating human organs like premium ingredients for some kind of specialized menu. I quickly backed away from the kitchen area and hid in a supply closet, trying to understand what I had discovered. My mind was racing as I tried to connect this horrific scene with the patterns I'd noticed: the wealthy, elderly passengers getting special attention, the disappearances of kitchen staff, the ordering of premium ingredients that couldn't be accounted for. As I was hiding in the closet, I heard footsteps approaching, and the door opened to reveal Laurent, who looked more annoyed than surprised to see me. "Chef Thompson," he said calmly, "I think we need to have a discussion about the boundaries of your consulting role." He escorted me to his private office, where he calmly explained what I had stumbled upon. The majestic Voyager was home to what he called the most exclusive dining experience in the world, a restaurant that served human flesh to a select clientele of extremely wealthy individuals who paid enormous sums for the ultimate taboo culinary experience. Laurent explained that the operation had been running for over 5 years and catered to billionaires, politicians, and celebrities who had exhausted every other form of exotic dining and were seeking something that couldn't be obtained anywhere else. The menu consisted of carefully selected passengers who met specific criteria. They were always traveling alone, had no close family connections, and had substantial assets that could be quietly transferred after their disappearance. The process was sophisticated and carefully planned. Target passengers would be identified before boarding through background checks and financial screenings. During the cruise, they would be gradually isolated, befriended by specific crew members, and eventually invited to participate in what they believed were exclusive wine tastings or private dining experiences. They would be sedated, killed humanly, and their bodies would be processed by the secret kitchen staff, who had been specially trained in butchering and preparing human flesh. The clients who consumed these meals paid between 500,000 and $1 million per person for the experience, and the operation generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue annually. The money was split between the cruise line executives, the kitchen staff who prepared the meals, and various crew members who helped identify and isolate the victims. Laurent offered me the same choice that I now realize had been offered to other staff members who had discovered the operation. I could either join the program and receive a substantial portion of the profits, or I could become part of the menu myself. He explained that my culinary expertise would be valuable in expanding the program, and that I could make more money in 1 year than I would in my entire normal career. I pretended to be interested while secretly planning my escape. Laurent assigned me to work with the special kitchen for the remainder of the cruise, supposedly to help develop new preparation techniques. But I used this access to document everything I could with a hidden camera and to gather evidence about the scope of the operation. What I learned was even more horrifying than I had initially realized. The program operated on multiple ships in the cruise line's fleet, and they had been serving human flesh to clients for years. They maintained detailed records of their victims, including profiles of their backgrounds, financial information, and even tasting notes about the quality of different individuals' meat based on their age, diet, and health status. The clients included some of the most powerful people in the world: politicians, business leaders, entertainment celebrities, and members of royal families. They would book special cruises specifically designed around these cannibalistic dining experiences, paying premium prices for what Laurent proudly called the ultimate luxury. On the final night of my contract, I managed to escape from the ship when we docked in Fort Lauderdale. I had uploaded all of my evidence to secure servers and had already contacted federal authorities before leaving the vessel. The FBI raid that followed uncovered one of the most shocking criminal operations in maritime history. The investigation revealed that the Majestic Voyager and 3 other ships in the fleet had been operating cannibalistic restaurants for over 7 years. 43 passengers had been murdered and served as meals to wealthy clients, generating over $200 million in revenue. Laurent Dubois, Captain Andrews, and 127 crew members were arrested on federal charges including murder, conspiracy, and operating a criminal enterprise. The client list that was recovered during the investigation included names that shocked the world and led to arrests and investigations in 12 different countries. The cruise line was shut down permanently, and several government officials resigned when their participation in the program was exposed. I no longer work in large-scale food service, and I've returned to running a small restaurant in my hometown because I learned that the most exclusive dining experiences in the world aren't about rare ingredients or exotic preparations. They're about powerful people who have become so disconnected from humanity that they view other human beings as nothing more than menu items. Every time I see a cruise ship advertisement promising dining experiences you'll never forget, I think about those 43 people who disappeared into that secret kitchen, and I wonder how many other ships are out there right now, serving meals that no civilized person should ever have to imagine. The ocean hides many secrets, but some secrets are so dark that they change everything you thought you knew about the nature of evil and how far some people will go in pursuit of the ultimate forbidden experience. The Majestic Voyager may have been shut down, but I know that somewhere in the world, there are other wealthy individuals still seeking that final taboo, and there are other ships willing to provide it for the right price.